So look, thank you very much for the opportunity to address all of you. I'll give you a little bit of introduction to myself. My name is Paul Webley. I'm a chemical engineer by training at the University of Melbourne, and have probably spent the last 25 years in various research capacities in terms of carbon emissions research. So how to reduce carbon emissions from a range of industries and technologies and so on and so forth. And in the last year or two, I've moved into hydrogen a lot more because I see that as being really one of the key opportunities for not just Australia, but the world going ahead. And I think most other countries, virtually all countries, have developed hydrogen roadmaps of how they will proceed to incorporate hydrogen into their structure. And it works particularly well with renewable energy. So I'll go straight into the presentation. Rebecca Yee, hi Rebecca, nice to see you again. Rebecca, hopefully, I certainly will ask you I'll ask you to handle the questions. How about that in the presentation?
Yeah, no worries.
Okay. So just real quickly, in terms of what I'll do, I'll give you the ABCs of hydrogen for some of you not familiar with this. And then I want to answer some things that I think are relevant to the Mallee, which is how much water do you need? I know that a lot of people are worried about the water usage because clearly you're in an agricultural area, you want water. Is the hydrogen industry going to take that away from you? How much solar do you need? Where are we at in hydrogen in Australia, and what's the future? And why do I think the Mallee is a really great place to make hydrogen? So hydrogen, as you all know, it's the simplest and most abundant element in the universe. And what's the best reason for using it? Well, when you use it, you don't make any carbon dioxide. You only make water. And what's more, you can take that water that you make and later on you can convert it back into hydrogen. So in a sense, it's a perfect energy carrier. So it's important to notice it's not a fuel, it's not an energy source, it's an energy carrier. It's just an intermediate in transferring photons and solar PV to the end use. It just carries that energy for you. And then the next question is, well, if it's so great, why aren't we using it? And the answer for that is really quite simple, but also quite subtle, is nature doesn't make hydrogen for us. We have to make it ourselves. It doesn't occur naturally. Unlike fossil fuels and coal and oil, which you dig out the ground and use, if you want to use hydrogen, you have to make it. You have to rip it off other molecules. And to do that, you need hardware and you need effort and you need energy and therefore you need money. And so it's cheaper for us to take things that nature has made and pollute in the process than it is to make an effort and use hydrogen. Real quickly, in terms of production, this graphic shows you that essentially there's two major ideological routes to making hydrogen. One is to use fossil fuels. As you know, fossil fuels are basically carbon-based, but they come with a lot of hydrogen in their structure. You can rip that hydrogen off using a variety of different technologies and make hydrogen. In the process, you release carbon dioxide. If you choose to, you could capture that carbon dioxide and store it, so you could reduce the emissions. And that's currently how hydrogen is made at the moment. There isn't a lot of carbon capture and storage done with hydrogen because we're not at that point yet, but it can be done. But it's by far the cheapest route to make hydrogen, unfortunately, at the moment, is with the fossil fuel route. 95% of the world's hydrogen is made that route. The route I'm going to talk about, which I think is very good for the Mallee, is the renewable resource route along the bottom. And you can see there, we're basically taking renewable resource energy. We're either going to split water and make hydrogen, or the other way to think about it is, and you have a lot of these opportunities in the Mallee, and that's biomass, either in the form of biogas or in terms of residue, agricultural forestry residue, which is renewable because you're growing the stuff, and that can also be processed to make hydrogen. So we mustn't forget about that opportunity for us. So I'm going to focus more on the water splitting side. So splitting the water is, you all know about electrolysis probably, but this slide is actually designed to give you some sort of quantitative information. So in terms of electrolysis, there's two main players, two main types of electrolysis. One is alkaline, the other is PEM, or so-called proton exchange membrane. Basically, the easy way to remember is one is alkaline, one is acid. And both of those will allow you to electrolyze water by putting electricity into it. And they are commercially available. Alkaline has been around for, believe it or not, more than 100 years and is made in a variety of scales. It's very mature technology, even though it's still developing. They typically make them in what they call stacks, and the stacks are anything from 100 kilowatts all the way up to 2 megawatts. So if you want more, you just stack them up, and it's sort of like the solar PV world. You just keep adding more and more stacks, and so you make more and more hydrogen. And the little diagram on the right shows you the concept is you have a PV panel, you're generating DC. You don't have to do a DC to AC conversion because your alkaline electrolyzer uses DC. And so you do have to have some electronics there to do some conversion. And then you're making your hydrogen. And that's what I would call a behind the grid opportunity, where you kind of then want to design your electrolyzer to track your solar PV. And then the graphic below that shows the same thing with the wind. Wind is making AC, so you have to have a converter there to do the same sort of thing. If you choose to run the electrolyzer off the grid and you buy a renewable energy through a PPA, then obviously you can run the, you'll have slightly different electronics, but you can run the electrolyzer continuously. Electrolyzers are not cheap. So a megawatt electrolyzer is about $2 million. So it's not something you want to buy and run 10% of the day. You want to buy it and run it all day if you can. So you've got to think about how you would do such a thing if you're going to rely heavily on renewable energy. In terms of roughly the energy values, typically these numbers may not mean a lot to a lot of you. 4.5 kilowatt hours makes a normal meter cubed, and 11 normal meters cubed is a kilogram. So what does that mean? 50 kilowatt hours makes a kilogram of hydrogen. Now that doesn't sound like a lot of hydrogen, but hydrogen is a very dense form of energy on a mass basis, and you don't need a lot of hydrogen to do things. So typically the kind of scale of electrolyzers that people talk about at a pilot demonstration sort of scale is a megawatt electrolyzer. And you can see the next bullet point there, you're going to get about 500 kgs a day. Now again, that may not sound a lot to you, but 500 kgs a day is a good size refueling station. There's hundreds of refueling stations around the world, and it will fuel tens of trucks, 10s to 50s of trucks and buses per day on 500 kilograms. And the reason for that is you don't need a lot of hydrogen to give you a large driving range. So if you look at a typical car, for example, a hydrogen fuel cell car, you put 5 to 10 kilograms of hydrogen in there and you can drive 500 kilometers. Now, of course, you think about your fuel tank of your car, it may be 60, 70 liters, which is roughly 50 kilograms, and that gives you the same range. So we're getting about 10 times as much energy from hydrogen on a per kilogram basis. The kicker, of course, is hydrogen is a very light gas. And in order to put 5 kilograms or 10 kilograms on your car, you have to compress it into a very high pressure tank. So you need a big tank. And so it hasn't really panned out, I don't think, that well for the normal passenger vehicle level. It's much more suitable for heavy duty trucking, where you have more volume available to put compressed hydrogen tanks on there. The other big thing I want to talk about is water usage. And a lot of people, I think, have probably the misconception about how much water you need, because you think you're going to need millions and millions of tons of hydrogen, so you're going to consume all the water, but it's actually very little water. So the graphic on the left-hand side shows you 3 technologies for making water. The middle one is electrolysis, so focus on that. You need 9 kilograms of water to make 1 kilogram of hydrogen. Now remember how much energy you get out of a kilogram of hydrogen. So so let's look at the graphic on the right, and thank you, Rebecca Yee, for making up this beautiful graphic. The top shows you typically, from an agricultural standpoint, you need 12 megaliters of water will irrigate 1 hectare of wine grapes and make 15,000 bottles of wine. 1 megaliter of water can produce 100 tons. That's 100,000 kilograms of hydrogen. That can fuel your B-double truck, which you can fit all those bottles of wine into, and you can do 240 return trips from Melbourne to Brisbane. So you're getting a lot of energy and from a pretty small amount of water. So the bullet point at the bottom, 500 kilowatts, which I think is a good starting sort of size for when you're starting to go into a region and say, okay, let's get cracking on hydrogen. How are we going to start? 500 kilowatts will give you 250 kilograms a day. That will allow you to fuel something like 10, 15 buses a day on a route, or many trucks a day. You're going to consume 2,000 liters per day. Okay, so that's a pretty small amount of water to consume for the kind of driving range you've got. I would also say that this doesn't have to be fresh water. The water is treated before it goes into the electrolyzer. If you buy a small electrolyzer, they come with the water treatment system. If you were to say up front, we're going to put a lot of electrolyzers in, then you probably would build a single central water treatment plant. You could run wastewater to it, and you just have to treat it to a high enough purity level to run the electrolyzer. So, and of course, the dirtier the water is, the more treatment you have to have. So I wouldn't, certainly from a starting standpoint, I wouldn't be worried about the water usage. It's a very small amount of water because the energy density of hydrogen is so high. Changing gears, where are we at? Well, last year we had the National Hydrogen Strategy, the Finkel strategy. We've had projects underway around the country. I'll show a few of those probably for the last 5 years. Many people are doing feasibility studies, including ourselves. I think we're sort of at the nascent stage of building up the skills, the workforce, the community confidence. The biggest thing with hydrogen is finding a demand for it. So it's relatively easy for us to get an electrolyzer, generate renewable energy and run it, but we can't find anyone to use the hydrogen. So, the key is who will give us an offtake agreement and say, we will take your hydrogen and give you money for it so that I can then go to the bank and finance an electrolyzer. So that's always been, it's a chicken and egg. That's been the problem for us. Just real quickly, some projects that are going on around the country. And following on from my comment about usage, at the moment, the only way to use it is we make it and we put it into the natural gas pipeline. So hydrogen burns, obviously burns CO2 free, and you can continue to add it to the natural gas pipeline, which is a wonderful storage reservoir, by the way. And you can add it up to about 10-15% in natural gas and continue to burn your cooker and all the other heating applications with very little change to anything that you have to make. So that's a really nice way to decarbonize our current natural gas system. Once you get above 10 or 15%, then we start having to look at how to change burners and that sort of thing. So this is the, many of you will have heard, this is the hydrogen park that they're building in Tonsley in Adelaide. That's a 1.2 megawatt electrolyzer that's going to be putting hydrogen into the grid. There's a lot of discussions by Neon about building a super hub, with hundreds of megawatts and having enough for export. But again, that's just discussion at the moment. There's the Gemina project in Sydney. That's going to be adding into the grid. A lot of these will have an on-site refueling station, just as a sort of a public educational thing, and there'll be a few cars and buses running around with that. There's a project out in Buller Island in Queensland. It's a small project, 220 kilowatt electrolyzer, and that's going to be powered by on-site solar, and that'll be used for some fuel cell applications. If you look at this diagram here, this sort of shows you the main uses of hydrogen. So think of the Mallee region and where you could play into these spaces, and you'll see this obviously power generation and grid balancing. So that's something where if you have a lot of excess solar, you might be able to use generation of hydrogen storage and then putting it back into the power grid as an opportunity. So there's a revenue stream there in terms of grid balancing. Instead of being told by the federal government that you've got to curtail your supply, can you start making hydrogen with that? Transportation side, there's a lot of opportunity, particularly if you have a heavy industry and agricultural base, and you have heavy vehicles. It's far more suitable for heavy duty vehicles than it is for light vehicles, for some of the reasons I said earlier. And then feedstock for industry and fuel for heating. Now, there may not be, depending on, if you have a lot of ammonia use, there's nothing to stop you setting up small ammonia production facility, making your own fertilizer. And you could make it with green hydrogen. And there's a lot of discussion and talk abroad about doing small scale plants that use hydrogen from electrolyzers for making ammonia and fertilizers. And then finally, of course, the fuel for blending. So transport, again, what I was saying, there are cars out there. Personally, I don't think cars are the way to go for hydrogen. I think heavy duty trucking. We're kind of right at the stage now where a lot of the big truck manufacturers are making fuel cell trucks. And I would say by 2022, 2023, we're probably going to see a lot of the big beverage companies and so on, or the big companies that do heavy duty trucking are going to be converting, 5%, 10% of their fleet and so on and so forth to hydrogen, because that's a very desirable back to base type of activity where you can have centralized, refueling stations. You can envisage, for example, Melbourne to Sydney, you could have refueling stations. You only need 2 or 3 along the Hume in order to run trucks backwards and forwards, because you can get the range on a truck. You can get 400, 500, 600, maybe 800 kilometers on a range of hydrogen. So it's a very attractive option right now. I won't go through this. This is really just the flow path of all the parts you need at a refueling station. What I do want to move to is the costing, but let's have a quick look at this. This is blending it into the pipeline. I can blend 15% hydrogen into a natural gas pipeline without any issues, and I get direct benefit. Of course, that's not cost effective at the moment. And the way the things are right now, natural gas is much cheaper than hydrogen. And so if you go to a natural gas supplier and you say, well, I can sell you hydrogen, they're only going to pay you natural gas prices for it. So that's not enough for you to be able to financially run your hydrogen business. So look at the costing, and this comes from the national strategy that was developed in last year. So what does hydrogen's cost have to be in order for us to be able to compete against competitive fuels? And the one that I think you should look at there is the diesel one, the middle one. If you're driving 100 kilometers using diesel at a retail price of $1.50 a liter, I think it's probably cheaper than that now. I would need to do the equivalent of the driving. I would need to make hydrogen at $11 per kilogram. Okay, now that's quite generous. In fact, I can make hydrogen cheaper than that right now. I can produce hydrogen at $6 to $12 a kilogram, and most of the cost of making hydrogen is the cost of the renewable energy. So about 70% of that $6 to $12 is the dollars I'm paying for the renewable energy. So if you have a behind the meter, much cheaper supply of renewable energy, you could probably be making that hydrogen at half of that cost, maybe $2 to $3. And now you're looking at something that is considerably cheaper to operate than diesel. So I think the transport options are absolutely the first place that you're going to look to put hydrogen in. If we can get renewable energy for less than $30 a megawatt hour, then we were at about a $5 a kilogram of hydrogen. And it's very, very competitive with diesel and petrol, particularly for large scale. So in a sense, it's very much comes down to how quickly can we get large scale trucking, tractors, agricultural vehicles that can operate on hydrogen fuel cells and that are not going to cost us an arm and a leg to purchase from a capital standpoint. In terms of heating and replacing natural gas, we have to really, that's probably the last thing you're going to do, because natural gas is so cheap at the moment that from a purely financial standpoint, if you're not getting any credits for the CO2 abatement, it's very hard to compete. And that's why a lot of this gas injection projects that are going on, they're just demo projects for the far future of when we ultimately want to use hydrogen. In terms of a commercial pathway to getting hydrogen into our infrastructure, I think transport is the way to go. And just as the last slide, I think the Mallee is a really ideal location. You've got a very good renewable energy resource, a very rich solar energy resource. You have opportunities for storage of that hydrogen. So, you have parts of the year where you have more use of that renewable energy than other parts of the year. Are you able to seasonally store that hydrogen? It's difficult. Hydrogen, of course, is a gas. It's difficult to store it by itself in large tanks. You can liquefy it and store it, but that's obviously expensive. And so, so your best bet is to store it in the natural gas pipeline when you don't need it. But if you, of course, if you have it and you have, there's underground storage. People talk about caverns of hydrogen storage. That's far away from reality, I think. And frankly, I think it's not on the near term. But certainly, pressurized storage tanks, natural gas pipeline as a storage. But the best thing is to use it as you make it for vehicles. You've got a concentrated agricultural and industrial infrastructure. So in other words, you're focusing more on heavy duty vehicles, which is exactly the space that we want to operate in. They've got room to put tanks on there. They need the long range, so they're not really suitable for batteries. And they need to run 24/7, and in many cases, 365 days a year. And so you need something where you have a reliable source of hydrogen all the time. There's a large biomass resource, which I think is interesting to look at. Biomass is certainly possible to make hydrogen from biomass. It's a little more complicated than electrolysis, but it's certainly an interesting option. If you've got biogas sources where your biogas is perhaps not rich enough in methane, and maybe it's only 20–30% methane and it's difficult to burn, you can add hydrogen to that to improve the calorific value. So it can complement biogas. And of course, the other thing in the Mallee is you're at a critical juncture for a lot of the transport infrastructure and transport going through that region. So you do have an opportunity that strategically to place hydrogen refueling facilities. And so I guess my question is, for the region, can we generate our own hydrogen there and reduce our dependence on diesel? And I would mention that you're not just offsetting CO2, you are removing a lot of the other emissions of diesel, the particulates, and all the other emissions as well. When you're burning hydrogen, all you're making is water. So that really just completes my ABCs of why I think hydrogen is great and why I think it would fit here. And I'd be happy to take any questions, as would Rebecca Yee. I will just introduce Rebecca just real quickly. Rebecca has been working with me in the last year to look at techno-economic assessments of a range of hydrogen production technologies, and we've been doing that for the Future Fuels CRC. And Rebecca's put together a very nice sort of skeleton, I think, of opportunities for the Mallee. So Rebecca, I don't know if you want to say a few more words as well.
Yeah, I think I pretty much just agree with everything Paul just said. A lot of the storage issue, I just wanted to add another point. You can also store it in ammonia form. So you can, I know there's a lot of demand for ammonia in that region. So I think the idea of having an ammonia plant would complement really well. And you can always convert ammonia back to hydrogen if you wanted. So there's a lot of options there. But I don't have anything else other than just to say, yeah, what Paul is saying. I think the dependence, the swapping over for diesel is the low hanging fruit. So any diesel gensets, generators, landscape equipment, trucks can be pretty readily replaced with hydrogen equipment.
Yeah. And the place that's really been running, is quite mature for 2 or 3 years in the US, is forklifts. Forklifts that run on hydrogen, little hydrogen fuel cells, have been commercially available. There's 20,000 of them being used in the US, and it's not so much the CO2. It's obviously when you're in a confined space of a warehouse and you've got forklift operators running around, carrying bags from one side to the other on their forklifts. It's not, you don't want fumes building up in those sort of areas. And so there's been a strong drive in the US and other places to replace forklifts completely from diesel and gas to hydrogen.